Good morning. This morning's scripture reading is the final 6 verses in the book of Job, chapter 42, verses 12 through 16. The author writes, "The Lord blessed the latter days of Job more than his beginning, and he had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 donkeys. He also had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He named the first Jemima, the second Keziah, and the third Karen Hapuk. In all the land there were no women so beautiful as Job's daughters, and their father gave them an inheritance along with their brothers. After this, Job lived for 140 years and saw his children and his children's children, 4 generations. And Job died, old and full of days." This ends this morning's reading. Thanks be to God for these words of life.
Perhaps you noticed in your bulletin this morning that this sermon is part 2 on how does God work. I did part 1 last week at my home church, the First Congregational Church of Western Springs. Apparently I have to do stuff there if I want them to ordain me. And I'm happy to be back preaching part 2 here. So for those of you who don't go to away games, I guess we don't travel well as a fan base. I'm not disappointed, but or if you didn't catch it online, I'll briefly address what I discussed last week and how it relates to our question this morning. Last Sunday I talked about how I see God at work in the world in sort of a more generalized way. It was an exploration into who and what God is and what God is actually doing in the world. The main point I was making was that in my life experience, I haven't seen God work so much through what you might call miracles as much as through people's behavior. When we comfort someone in need, or we give voice to someone who is silenced, or feed someone who is hungry, that is God working in the world. And as a church, we are gathered together to learn and then do God's work in the world. This Sunday is also about the work of God, but by answering a specific question. The question being, could God heat a burrito so hot that even Jesus couldn't eat it? You may be surprised to hear this, but this is a question I've been thinking about since I was in high school. It was a tradition in the youth group at Congo, which is shorthand for my home church, First Congregational Church of Western Springs, because that is indeed a mouthful. But it was a tradition in our youth group to always submit that question at the fireside chat, where one or more of the pastors would come to the evening meeting and field questions. They would read the question aloud. We would, of course, all laugh, and then they would move on to the next question. I've since relayed that story to the adults and youth here at Union Church, and so when I mentioned that we were doing a sermon series on answering questions from the congregation, Matt Killens jumped at the opportunity and said he wanted a real answer to that question. And I should have seen this coming, but Mike and Bromley, like the good parents they are, essentially said to me, "You made your bed, now lie in it." So here we are this morning, talking about whether hypothetically God could act in the world by creating a burrito so hot that even Jesus couldn't eat it. And the answer, I think, is actually pretty straightforward. Now, I'm operating under the assumption that this scenario takes place after Jesus' birth, but before the crucifixion, resurrection, and ascension into heaven. If we're talking about Jesus seated at the right hand of God, and God just hands him a burrito, I have no idea how that would work. Is heaven a physical place with physical burritos? If everything is perfect in heaven, wouldn't the burrito have to be the perfect temperature? There's way too many unknowns in that scenario. So this is Jesus as a human being, although fully divine, on earth, holding a super, super hot burrito. And I hope you're taking a second to create a mental picture, because mine is hilarious. But the other unknown that we're contending with is whether hot is in reference to the actual temperature of the burrito or the spiciness. I don't know the original intent of whoever thought up that question, but I'm going to go with temperature because that's how I've always thought of it. And I'm pretty sure this sermon works both ways nonetheless, but I didn't want that detail to distract you, of course, while I was giving this sermon. So with this foundation laid, I believe the answer to this question is yes. God could heat a burrito so hot that even Jesus couldn't eat it. Although Jesus is fully divine, Jesus is also fully human. And we know from the story that Jesus experiences physical pain and death. Although Jesus is resurrected, he's not invincible. He's whipped and beaten and all sorts of other nastiness. And so if I believe that he's human enough, or I believe that if he's human enough to bleed from a crown of thorns, then he is human enough to burn his mouth on a burrito. The question, super funny, or maybe just to me it is, but the answer, not so funny. However, as I reflected on the answer, I was led, as is often the case with these kinds of hypothetical religious questions, to another deeper question. Could God heat a burrito so hot even Jesus couldn't eat it? Yes. But would God? Would God heat a burrito so hot even Jesus couldn't eat it, and then ask him or make him eat it anyway? The question for me has more of an impact on how I choose to live my life and how I choose to view the world and my role in it. Because what that question is asking more generally is, what is God's role in suffering? Last week I spoke about how I've seen God act in my life, which had kind of a feel-good message to it. However, simply because I've seen God act in my life through blessing, perhaps, doesn't really address the other side of the coin. What is God's role in relation to the pain and suffering in our lives? It's like this little anecdote I heard. I'm not sure I remember quite where. It may have been Mike that told me this. But it's a group of parishioners go to a pastor of their church, and they ask if they could put together a praise band. And the pastor thinks about it for a second, and then he says, "Sure, as long as we also have a lament band." Which seems ridiculous, but Paul calls us to rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. And so if all we talk about is praise and blessing, then we're missing a big piece of the puzzle. Which brings us to our scripture reading this morning from the book of Job. This is an incredible book of the Hebrew Bible. I can't possibly do it justice in one sermon. But for those of you who are already familiar with the book, I hope you liked my pun. I can't do justice to it? Okay, anyway. This book addresses God's relationship to human suffering, but does so in a narrative fashion. However, before we get started, in an effort to be as transparent as possible, much of the commentary I'm sharing with you today comes from various biblical scholars. I am simply not cut out for rigorous biblical scholarship, especially when the books aren't originally written in English. It makes it a lot harder. So I've pulled from a few different sources, but I'm mostly relying on Martin Buber, who is was an early 20th century Jewish philosopher who did some incredible work in dialogical existentialism, but that is for another day. Today, we're doing our best to keep it simple and talk about Job. So the book of Job starts with God up in heaven, and God is so proud of this wealthy and happy, and most importantly, faithful guy named Job. Then there is this character named Satan, but it's not our sort of medieval Christian idea of Satan. Think of him more like a litigator to God as judge. And I know there's a lawyer joke somewhere in there, but I have too much love for this bag of pants to make a joke like that. But nonetheless, this Satan essentially says to God, well, of course he's faithful. He's got a great life. I bet if you didn't give him all those blessings, he'd be singing a different tune. So God takes him up on this bet with the caveat that Satan doesn't kill Job. And as is expected, things go sideways for Job pretty quickly. His livestock die, his crops die, his children die. He gets some terrible illnesses. Everything that can go wrong does. And here is where we find the first view of God in the book of Job. A God that works with humans the way humans do with pieces on a chessboard, or maybe like horses in a race. For those of you familiar with Greek and Roman mythology, this kind of God might sound familiar. The reader is not really supposed to believe that this kind of God is our God. The author is merely setting up the story to provide a backdrop so other ideas of God can be brought forward. So after everything goes to hell in a handbasket, Job's friends show up, supposedly to comfort him, but the bulk of the next section is them going back and forth and giving him bad reasons for why this is happening to him, and then Job giving rebuttals. They believe in a direct cause and effect, punishment-reward system of divine justice. And some suffering is no mystery. I mean, I think some of the suffering in our lives is like this. If you've ever fallen away from running or working out and then gone back to the gym, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Getting back in shape has a certain punishment aspect to it for not making healthy decisions earlier. We make poor decisions and then suffer the consequences. But this is definitely not how all suffering works. There is plenty of guiltless suffering in our world. There are countless illnesses that people of all ages, for example, suffer from that have no basis in their personal decisions. So the two gods we are presented with so far are the cruel God, who makes bets like, I bet I can get people to eat super hot burritos and they'll still love me. Or the reasonable and rational God, whom Job and I would argue we don't experience in the world because things don't always work out fair. Sometimes, to stretch the metaphor a bit farther, we have to eat super hot burritos. Part of life is undergoing undeserved suffering, which a reasonable and rational God wouldn't allow for. What's fascinating is that the patience of Job is often held up in the Christian community as a virtue, this sort of suffering servant of God, patiently obedient in faith, awaiting that inevitable reward for loyalty. But if you actually read the story, Job isn't patient at all. He is complaining and protesting, and for good reason, throughout the entire book. And through this protesting, we arrive at the third kind of God, a God that is separated from justice. So justice still exists, as does God, but justice in the world is not included in the domain of righteousness, God's domain of righteousness. Perhaps an early precursor to the God as watchmaker argument that was popularized during the early years of the scientific revolution. You may be asking yourself, how does this relate to burritos? Whenever we have to eat a super hot burrito in our lives or deal with suffering, God is nowhere to be found in this conception of God. But we as Christians don't really believe that either. So we are left with our fourth and final conception of God, which comes at the end of the story when God makes two speeches directed at Job. On the surface, if you read the text, God essentially says, I'm so grand and so mysterious and so incomprehensible. How could you possibly know why I do the things that I do? Never mind that it was just to settle a bet with another angel. And so if this is taken literally, this to me would be a pretty terrible ending to the book. If God essentially just humiliates Job, Job grovels and humbles himself before God in an apology, and then as we heard in the scripture reading, then God just restores all of Job's stuff. For how impressive the writing in this book is, up until this point, for God to essentially intimidate Job into submission is a weak ending. So I can't believe that that's what is really happening here. God refers a lot in these speeches to God's role as the creator, hearkening back to Genesis. And we see at the end, God does a lot more creating for Job. Melissa read for us, the Lord blessed the latter days of Job more than his beginning. And he had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 donkeys. I don't know what you do with 6,000 camels, but apparently Job is excited about that. So God's creative power is clearly playing a role in how the story is wrapped up. And not only is God talking about creative power and creating, But God is doing all of this while speaking directly to Job. This is a God of revelation who makes God's self known to humanity and desires to be in relationship with us. But what I want to emphasize most is the children. Can you just replace children? No, of course not. But the story is clearly a story. And the children Job is blessed with at the end are now sort of magically adult children. So it's almost as though they have been replaced from the children at the beginning of the book. But their replacement is not the fascinating part to me. What's fascinating is how they are described. The author writes, he also had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He named the first Jemima, the second Keziah, and the third Karen Hapuk. In all the land there were no women so beautiful as Job's daughters, and their father gave them an inheritance along with their brothers. The 7 sons stay anonymous. They are not given names. Pretty much nowhere in the Bible do women have names and the men do not. This is a stark departure from the patriarchal way that most of these stories are told. And furthermore, they receive inheritances just like their brothers, which is also way out of the ordinary. And their names, translated, their names mean dove, a symbol of peace, cinnamon, a symbol of abundance, and eyeshadow, which is apparently a symbol for female grace. These 3 daughters are honored with beauty, names, and inheritances, and nearly get the last word on the story. The book of Job does not provide an answer to the question of suffering and justice, and I can't either. Undeserved suffering has happened, happens, and will continue to happen. Much of this is out of anyone's control. It is certainly out of Job's control in this story, as my undeserved suffering is out of my control, and I'm willing to bet that yours is or has been out of your control. In the end, Job realizes this, realizes that we as humans will not know why bad things happen to good people, or why sometimes we have to suffer through burning our mouths on the super hot burritos of life. But once Job lets go, the story shifts to appreciating the beauty in creation, the abundance that God provides in many different ways, and the female grace where the male compulsion to control has no place. The story begins with the exhausting undertaking of grappling with complex philosophical concepts. Job and his friends are really trying to conceptualize what is actually going on. But once Job sees that he will never know why bad things happen to good people, he is able to see life through almost a mystical lens. He begins to yield his control to the mystery that is God. And through what the author characterizes as a feminine sense of grace, can appreciate the beauty and abundance that are present in our world despite the suffering. Ryan saying, "Those who trust in the Lord are a strong mountain, they will not be moved." Job reimagines what trusting in the Lord looks like. It is not a trust that he will be protected from suffering, but a trust that God is still present and active despite the suffering. That's the strong mountain of faith, the mountain that weathers storms, not the mountain that is magically protected from storms. Would God make Jesus or any one of us eat a burrito that was too hot? I don't know. But our experience tells us that if you live long enough on this earth, you'll encounter some hot burritos that you have to eat, whether we like it or not. And we won't know why this burrito, this suffering, has been put before us. And we can try to control and hypothesize and explain why it hurts so much while eating it. Or we can lean into the painful mystery of suffering. And despite the burning sensation in our mouths or in our hearts, We can try to appreciate the abundance of flavors in that burrito that life has to offer. The peace that can come with a full stomach, and the beauty of a world that makes burritos not only too hot, but in the full range of temperatures.